we're going to touch on the similarities and the differences of all three of my compressors. And I'd mentioned earlier about nitrogen pressure, about controlling the pressure settings for nitrogen in different parts of your system. Well, up here on my rail, I have a maximum that I don't want to exceed because of my Marshall railcar ESVs, and the maximum there is 50. And so my nitrogen system is broken up into the truck loading area and the rail area, and then my vapor system. And so here's the section where I control and regulate my nitrogen going up to my rail towers. And so I've got this thing set roughly about 46 pounds. And then when I open this one up, that sends nitrogen up to my rail towers, sends nitrogen to the internal valves on my tanks, and puts nitrogen at the palm valves for my internal valves for my recovery line. So I pull that out, and then you can see it's just now going to start recovering. And this is my way to ensure that I don't exceed a preset PSI up there for my Marshall ESVs. Every compressor has got an emergency shutdown. And since I'm done with this, I'm riding right around 42 pounds. That's with me running 80 pounds coming in my main line. My incoming line here is 80 PSI roughly. And so we're cutting it down to that. And so I'm going to go ahead and dump that. This was our first compressor right here. This is a Corken T as in Tom 891. This is a sort of a custom build from a company we bought it from called NB Transit. They're up in Canada. They take just a stock Corken compressor, and then he custom makes his own base, his own liquid trap, and then he deviates from Corken, and that Corken runs a 2-inch four-way valve. His is 3-inch. So 3 in, 3 out, all the way around. As you can see, it's roughly so high compared. It's about that much taller than a D891. Another thing they do at NB Transit is they put a manual bypass valve in here so that when this valve is in this position and your compressor's running, it just lets product circulate. You're not really shoving anything out of this compressor. What gives you the advantage with something like this is when you're going from offloading to recovery. We're here in offload position, and so you come down, compressor's running, the valve's engaged the whole time it runs. You're ready to switch, so you push this up, lets everything circulate, takes a lot of pressure off of here. You can raise your four-way valve in the recovery position, set your other valves over here to open up your recovery lines, and then you just pull that down, re-engage the compressor, and you can do all that without having to physically shut the compressor down. If you don't have a manual bypass valve, then of course you just shut down, do everything, get it all in position, then restart. This gives you more options. This gives you more flexibility. And so that's what they do at NB Transit, is they do that. One thing I want to point out is there's a relief valve, and I have a pipe away adapter. Over here, installed a pipe away adapter so that if that relief pops, the sound of it is going to be at least 2 feet above everybody's head. It's just going to try to keep the noise level down. And that's just a simple piece of aluminum pipe. And then I just take the cap off of a spray paint can or other kind of spray can and wrap some painter's tape around, and I use that for a weather cap. Super simple, nothing too complicated there. One thing I want to point out is that this holding tank is just that. It's just a holding tank. It's not an ASME pressure vessel like one Corken would manufacture. And it has a float switch, so if your liquid level ever gets up this high, That float switch will lift up, kill the machine. There's also some internal piping that he has run inside here to also act as a secondary safety. So liquid would have to get up really pretty high before this thing would actually suck in product. And as I mentioned earlier about my scavenger tank, these compressors normally come with just a ball valve right here that you can open up to drain. Well, I didn't want that. I wanted a pressure gauge here, and then I put in my 2-inch sight glass with a back check. So now all I can do is look into here while the compressor's running, and I'll see if there's any liquid building up inside the compressor. If there is, I just open that up, drain it to the scavenger tank, and shut it back off. I'll show you on my newest compressor. I'll get a close-up picture of the contact information for NB Transit, so if it's something you're interested in, you can give them a call. This base, this is a rolled base, and when we originally had it, we didn't grout underneath of it. Well, because the way the studs are here on this, I can't grout all the way here because I didn't want to encase all the threaded studs into grout. So from about here over, we put in about 250 pounds of grout. Even though I didn't fully grout the base, putting in just 250 pounds of grout stabilized this compressor immensely. And then you come over here, this is a standard cork and skid assembly. This is the D as in David 891. You can see it's shorter. It's in the packing. This base here is a typical cork and skid base. I believe it's a model 107. Anyway, this was easier to fill with grout. We put about 350 pounds, or maybe a little bit more, probably closer to 400 pounds of grout in here. We just made sure to stop in some places to where we didn't grout in the bottom of any bolts. Grouting this in, just like the other one, stabilizes that whole compressor, even though we are heavily anchored. And our anchors go down inside here, at least 20 inches, maybe a little bit more. And our base is an overbuilt base compared to what Corken recommends. So even with overbuilding it and over anchoring it, you still get vibration. Grouting them in makes a huge difference. So if you have the opportunity to grout it in, I would strongly encourage you to look into doing that. And it takes more grout than what you might imagine. You can buy grout at like Lowe's, Home Depot, Menards. It's usually in like a 50-pound bag. Get the non-shrink grout. You can also buy a commercial size bags of grout that's a higher PSI and overall a little bit better grout, and they come in like 80-pound bags, I believe. Corken, this is not the original 4-way valve that came with this Corken. The original one was that really cheapo, terrible flow 4-way valve. And it had like a stamped metal handle. It was all 2-inch, but of course it never flowed 2-inch. It flowed like more like 1.25 on the inside. Well, Corken upgraded and switched to suppliers and went to this a few years back. And I bought this one when I first found out about it. The only difference is it's slightly bigger, like an inch or so taller and wider. So it was no big deal. My welder was on site doing something else, so I pulled this piece and I had my welder adjust this piece. And then it was just a matter of changing my fittings here, because I still run 3-inch and then reduce down to 2, and then try to run 3-inch as much as possible to try to keep my flow nice and high, nice and smooth. The Corken has is its own, it's an ASME pressure vessel. It's got its data tag on the other side. That's why it has its own separate relief valve. You can see the size of that pressure gauge there. That's pretty standard. From even NB Transit, theirs aren't much bigger than that. It works, it's a good gauge, but the older I get, the harder it is to see these smaller gauges. So I've replaced all of mine with 4-inch, and then I mount them in such a way that they can clear my piping and everything's easier to read. This corking is also built to where you could put a glass tube in here and use it as a sight glass. I just tapped into here and put this one in because I didn't want to keep trying to look at that one. This has 2 float switches. This one acts as a warning. If your liquid level gets this high, it'll trip and it'll turn on that strobe light up there so that it becomes a visual cue. You can see it in the cameras if it ever goes off. And then this other float switch is a kill. Gets up that high, just shuts it down. The NB Transit liquid trap, unless they've changed something, does not have a stainless steel mesh in it to trap propane liquid droplets and get them to condense and fall out. The corking one does. Up here in this upper part, there's a stainless steel mesh up inside there, and propane liquid droplets will collect on it and then drop out. Do the same thing here. I got a 2-inch sight glass and a ball valve, and I can just look in the side and see if what or how much liquid accumulation that I get. This one did not come like the NB Transit. Both of my NB Transit ones come with a manual bypass valve in the system. This one did not come with it. So the first few months we had this, you had to shut it down, switch your 4-way valve and your valving around, then start it back up. Well, I thought, you know, there's got to be a way to do it. I don't have a welder. I don't know how to weld. I don't have a torch. So whatever it is I do, I had to come up with an idea that did not involve any kind of hot work. Yet I still wanted to come up with a way to do it. Plus I had a lot of parts left over from the last upgrades that we did. So I built this here out of spare parts that were laying around that we had left over. And it does the exact same thing, the nicer bypass valves. It works super slick. For me, it's been a game changer. And if you don't have a manual bypass valve, I would strongly encourage you to look into the possibility of seeing if you could build one or have somebody build you one. It is just nice to not have to shut these compressors down during the whole offload and recovery process. Plus, if you have an issue, you know, you can bypass that and leave your compressors running while you go and you deal with any other issues that you get. One of the things that Corgan talks about in their manual is installing some drains in the cylinder head area. There's channels, I don't know if they're cast or machined, inside these components here on these Corgan compressors, and they show in there to install a drain so you can vent off pressure. And it's also a good way to find out if you are getting any kind of liquid inside your cylinder head. This one's a little easier to see simply because it's up a little bit higher. I just installed a snubber, street L, and needle valve. You can open that up while you're running, or like we're going to do here, we're going to open it up before we take off any parts on the compressor, and it's a way to vent off any pressure inside that head before you do any work on it. And it's also a good way if you suspect that you may have been pulling some liquid into your compressor. It's a good way where you can do it while you're running. You take that and you open this up, or over here on this one I've got 2. Yeah, it's a little tough to tell. I got one in here and I got one up in here. You can open them up while you're running and it should just be vapor. But if you start getting white fog coming out of there, shut your compressor down, shut your valves off. You've got to figure out where you picked up some liquid at and how to get rid of it. It's just to me, it's been very, very helpful. It has prevented some problems, and it just makes working on the compressors so much easier because all I got to do is open them up and I can depressurize that compressor before I do any work, and I can be have a high level of confidence that I won't get surprised by anything if I start pulling components off of this compressor. Over here is the newest one. This one, I actually made a pressure vessel out of that one. This one also has just one float switch. I also installed a sight glass with a back check here, doing the same thing. Run it over there, drain it into my scavenger tank. This is my newest NB Transit. It's the newest model out there. And so again, he's running a 3-inch 4-way valve. I changed these out so that they're easier to read. I only installed one in this head, and it's got a different style cap on those. And this one is, because it's new, it is just stiff. It is very difficult to use, but it works really good, and I'm hoping in another year or so of just constant use that packing should loosen up. And again, I just vented it all. Avid believer in the quality of Rego. Regos have been the most trouble-free for me. Anytime you pop one, anytime you do something and your safeties don't kick in and you pop the relief, you have to change your relief valve. A lot of guys say you don't. Manufacturer says you do. Just change them. I always keep one spare and one spare pipeway adapter all the time. Here you can see my 3 safety switches right here in the float. This is my oil pressure. Oil pressure is normally electrically open. I have a high temperature. High temperature is electrically normally closed. This is supposed to be high pressure, but it's really a low pressure. It is supposed to be electrically closed. So when you go, this is always in a loop, that's in a loop. Same thing with your float switch, it's normally closed. When you start this compressor, you have to generate somewhere between 11 and 13 psi of oil pressure before this thing will close. Then your compressor will continue to run. One thing also that I do that helps me is your oil dipstick here. When they come from the factory, they're just knurled. And I don't know about you, but when you try to get your fingers in there and try to turn that and pull that out, is just miserable. So I drill them, and I put a little spring pin, like a hinge pin, in there. And now it's just super easy to pull that out. Just hook it in there, lift it up. There you go. This is a crankcase vent. If you ever start venting a noticeable amount of propane vapor, that means your packing in here is going bad. So that's just a tell. Otherwise, this is just a vent for your crankcase. And then I'll show it on the other one, but there's our oil adjusting screw. We're going to end up taking off that side plate, and I'll show you why. And then our data plate's over here, and we take that off to where we put in the oil. Let's come around over to here. Another emergency stop. There's that. There it is, NB Transit. They're French Canadians. Their English is pretty good. They seem more comfortable in French. I don't know exactly what their service range is, but I know it's pretty big, and I'm sure they'll ship you anything you want. If you're looking and you're wanting to quote out some equipment for corking compressors, I would strongly encourage you to contact them and at least get a quote. There's my line for my high temperature. This has just got a remote capillary tube. The one on my compressor 2 we're going to work on, the high temperature switch mounts right inside here. And then this line goes to my pressure switch down there.